This is Southern Discomfort. The labor movement in the South was dealt a heavy blow in April when workers at an Amazon fulfillment center in Bessemer, Alabama, voted roughly 2-1 against unionizing with the retail, wholesale, and department store union. The loss came on the heels of other recent unsuccessful attempts to unionize Volkswagen and Nissan plants in Tennessee and Mississippi. But the stakes seemed higher in Bessemer. Leading the labor campaign at the Alabama warehouse were black workers who risked losing their jobs to speak out against one of the world's most powerful and fastest-growing corporations in the least unionized region in the country. Workers described grueling conditions in the warehouse where they say Amazon placed productivity above their safety. The union struggle in Bessemer captured the attention of the media, who lavished mostly friendly coverage upon the workers' struggle and garnered the support of public officials like President Joe Biden. If you were only watching the campaign online from afar, you might have expected a huge union victory. Folks in the South knew better. Southern states continue to supply corporations like Amazon with a steady source of cheap and coercive labor. It is little wonder that union density in the region remains the lowest in the nation, and yet it is the region that could determine the future of labor in America. To be clear, the RWDSU made plenty of miscalculations that contributed to the Bessemer blowout. However, the union struggle at the Amazon fulfillment center was never going to be a fair fight. While Amazon publicly extolled the value of black lives, the corporation unleashed a ruthless and well-financed anti-union campaign upon its majority black workers in the lead-up to the union election. The company barraged workers with disinformation and lies about the union. Meanwhile, union avoidance experts charging Amazon thousands of dollars per day held captive audience meetings in an effort to turn workers against the union. Amazon even tried to turn the entire Bessemer community against the union by threatening to withdraw the fulfillment center, a major source of jobs and revenue, out of the area. Joining me now to dissect the Bessemer union drive and the importance of social movement unionism in the effort to organize rank-and-file workers in the South, and workers of color in particular, is Saladin Muhammad. Muhammad is a retired international rep for the United Electrical Workers Union and a founding member of both Black Workers for Justice and the Southern Workers Assembly. Before we jump in and analyze the union campaign in Bessemer, I think we should recognize the struggles of the workers themselves at the Amazon warehouse. Can you talk about what the rank-and-file workers in Bessemer were able to accomplish despite an all-out assault waged by Amazon?
Well, I think what they achieved was opening up a new period of support for organizing labor in the South. The attraction to the Bessemer campaign occurred across the U.S. and in parts of the working class struggle. The emergence of a workers' struggle led by black workers during a period of national black resistance shown by the Black Lives Matter movement against police murders and state-sanctioned violence against black, brown, indigenous peoples was a testament of what a sentiment, a movement for black liberation could have on the emergence of labor struggles, particularly in communities and workplaces that had significant numbers of black workers, and certainly where the black workers are a majority and the communities that they live in are a majority. So I think that was been a very important development that one does not begin to understand looking purely through a union campaign lens. Obviously, this campaign taking on one of the largest corporations in the world showed the courage of these workers in Bessemer and of the communities that supported them because what was at stake, particularly promoted during the anti-union, Amazon's anti-union campaign, were jobs that paid more than the average worker in Alabama and certainly in the Bessemer, Birmingham area, and also this threat that the plant might close, affecting the economy of the city and the surrounding areas. This was the challenge that these workers were facing. So this was courageous. However, going into this campaign, recognizing just the size of this corporation, the weakness of a wider basis for unionizing or building a movement, infrastructure, if we call it the infrastructure of a movement throughout the Amazon corporation, so that the campaign becomes bigger than a one facility campaign, of that this was a tactical and possibly even a strategic weakness in the decision to take on Amazon from the union's perspective or from a union perspective. But there emerged throughout Amazon the beginnings of new committees in different places. New contacts have been made, particularly coming off of the solidarity actions that were organized across the country in February and in March. The opportunity to follow up on these new contacts now exists and has begun in several places toward forming organizing committees that can develop the actual infrastructure to begin to develop a more Amazon-wide strategy. This, I think, has been, the important development. But I think that's some of the things that I think opens up a new period, not only of organizing in Amazon, but organizing in other industries, particularly in the South, where unions are the weakest and where there's really a history of low wages, worker divisions around race, immigration status. And so I think we have to look at how to fashion a strategy around these new developments.
Were you at all surprised by the results of the election? Or were you prepared for a defeat given the strong anti-union sentiments here in the South and the difficulty that most workers here face organizing their workplaces?
Well, was prepared, for one could call it a defeat. I guess, you have to say that. But, for a stolen election, for a stolen vote. Yeah. Yes, again, looking at the odds from the standpoint of how widely an inside Amazon campaign, we felt is needed. And so, we saw that the chances were that the union would lose this vote. We never tried to project that. We always tried to project The struggle is to win. And the winning features, was the development of a movement, a greater learning about Amazon, about its anti-union strategies, about how the industry is operated, the surveillance, and those things. We tried to project to show what the workers are up against, so that a defeat, you know, don't simply look at what some might call union mistakes or union errors or some other things. If they obviously got to be looked at, and talked about. But the odds of any a union organizing Amazon one workplace at a time without a wider national strategy would not have better chances necessarily than the RWDSU had.
Can you speak to the perspective of union organizing versus union elections? Do we sometimes put too much stock in election victories at the expense of the hard work of organizing?
When we look at the 1930s, when anti-union laws, basic worker right laws did not exist, the late 20s and the early 30s, and you saw organizations that were formed that were not unions, but they were kind of, progressive or leftist organizations that had a view that the working class needed to be organized in these core industries, and in order for there to be some measure of power to make important changes. And so you had actions like even in the Flint struggle in 34, which were workers organized, in a sit down strike, which they organized, the rank and file organized to really become part of the UAW. And you had, this example in a number of major industries, the steel workers organizing committee, textile workers. You had that, and this was kind of organized by the radical elements who saw organizing unions as a part of the class struggle, if you will. And the organizational forms, obviously, the move toward unionization was a stage of that movement. Now, I raised that brief history to say that organizing in the South is going to need a similar kind of strategy, building a kind of an infrastructure movement or a social movement uh, that's really taking on industries and therefore one might say on capital in a way that mobilizes working people, families, children, everybody, as a part of this social movement to organize labor. So we in the Southern Workers Assembly, we were looking at what this campaign could develop in that direction of creating a network that begins the process of building an infrastructure in key industries, including Amazon, that could foster a real movement to organize labor in the South. We've talked about this in terms of what it means to having a strategy that relates and highlights a union campaign as a battle, as a front that produces some developments that got to now be worked with and developed from being spontaneous to more intentional, more planned. The solidarity actions around the country have been contacting the Southern Workers Assembly about participating in the Southern Workers School, and we agreed that probably the same training and information that we will be providing for the Southern Solidarity actions committees will be beneficial for organizing workers' assemblies in other places across the U.S. We think, for example, that this Bessemer campaign really needed the early support of the official labor movement, the AFL, the Change to Win, etc., to rise up and to mobilize support to show these workers, these black majority workers, that labor in its majority is behind this struggle, etc. This, we believe, would have been, and not that it's not too late, or not that it's too late, but it would have been a very important contribution to encouraging the unity of the workers against the system of systemic racism that divides them largely from black workers, and to create divisions among the working class. When this doesn't happen, there could be a real feeling that somehow these struggles are led by the black working class is not as important to the labor movement as other campaigns and struggles. These are the kind of opportunities that labor can't afford to continue to miss as the U.S. and global economy and the technological innovations and changes that have been made, and the crisis in the economy that's even creating a greater desperation among the employers and corporations. The labor movement can't afford to miss these opportunities that would be pushing back against the Trumpism, against the divisions that also led to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I think we have to really see the importance that this campaign has, why labor has to, in hopefully discussing and summing up this experience, have to really see some of the larger questions that have historically divided the working class, and also that sometimes divides the labor movement into of itself. This is a period now we're hoping and trying to contribute to, where there's going to be a major discussion about organizing, a major discussion, about organizing the South, a major discussion about black workers, and the important role that they play or can play in organizing labor, particularly in the South. That's important. Hopefully, your article can contribute to this kind of a discussion. But the rank and file has got to play a major role in promoting this discussion in their local unions, in their regional and national conventions and structures, so that it becomes a popular discussion reflecting a new period emerging for organizing labor.
Public support for unions is at a higher point now than we have seen in 15 years. During the Black Lives Matter protests and the coronavirus pandemic, we saw workers, including meatpackers, health workers, even highly paid basketball players, stop work on their jobs. Do you think it's become easier for workers to take a stand in the workplace, even though there are obviously tremendous forces that are aligned against them?
Well, I don't know how easy it is going to be. I think how this is promoted as a tactic of power, a tactic to exercise power, and not a tactic, to mainly shame the system. I think shaming the system is very important. And I think that the strikes of the athletes, played an important role in shaming the system. However, it's important to prepare, to actually prepare, and not, to rely on spontaneous efforts. The athletes, they need all of the praises that we can provide, but they were largely spontaneous, and they identify themselves with the movement, like the Black Lives Matter movement, which again particular demands that more reflected the demands of the Black working class, which is the overwhelming majority of Black people. That these demands have to be sharper, so that the responses might be more widespread in terms of tenant strikes and worker strikes and those kinds of things. So no, I don't think it's necessarily going to be easier. Again, I think that if we're not, working to build an infrastructure, particularly targeting some of these core industries, like Amazon and auto and meat packing, and hospitals and those kinds of core industries, unless we are really developing a strategy to concentrate and to bore into these elements, then I think, what we would hope could be an example of exercising workers' power as a social movement around some working class wide demands, national health care, for example, community control of police, cutting the military budget significantly, to use for social needs, etc. Demands that require collective power to be mobilized and exercised. We got to prepare for that. And we have to think in those terms, about not only being able to enter into an agreement, a contractual agreement with corporations, which is a part of what the fight is in terms of reforms, but how we understand these struggles must seek to alter the power relations between the working class and the corporations and the government that protects those corporations, etc. And again, I think how we begin to describe campaigns like Bessemer and Medicare for All and these kinds of things, has to be shaped, with that kind of perspective. And I don't think that represents some kind of extreme, abstract, idealistic, point of view, particularly when you see when people begin to understand the pandemic, like people will be left to die because the failure of the government to timely act when it became aware of the deadliness of this virus, and that political football was involved around this question, when it failed to even show that the impacts were disproportionately affecting black people, brown people, indigenous people. Then people will really begin to understand the level of power that has to be built, and what that power must seek to do about trying to transform the system that we live under. So this period is an opportune period, but it's going to really, really require kind of a unity of the many small and desperate forces, including the trade union movements, the workers' centers, and the like, to be combined into more social justice or social movement unionism that has a program that really speaks to the needs of the larger working class.
Some people have this perception that if things get so bad, maybe that will be enough to convince legislators to pass something like Medicare for All. Well, we're in the midst of a global pandemic that has claimed the lives of nearly 600,000 people in the U.S., and we still don't have guaranteed health care. I think some of the same people who thought that public goods like healthcare would rise up out of the ashes are now coming to the realization that we can't shortcut the tremendous amount of work that will have to be done in order to bring about transformative social change. What do you think?
Again, I think, that there's a tendency to measure periods of struggle by electoral periods. And, when we do that, I think, we either underestimate and sometimes overestimate, what the potential of our movement is. The Medicare for All, the strikes around COVID were strikes around employer companies providing PPE and hazardous pay and paid medical leave, etc. Again, they were very important demands, but the question of whether or not, or one of the major demands of strikes, is around Medicare for all. And again, that's not going to be spontaneous. I mean, there's been a growing movement for Medicare for all among the trade unions. Just imagine if the trade unions called for Medicare for all strikes, 1 day strikes, 2 day strikes, rolling strikes, what that could actually mean for the pressure to pass Medicare for all. These stimulus bills going up into the trillions and the multi-trillions, when you talk about what went to the corporations, we begin to see that this system, this government taxing the corporations, that Medicare for all could be passed, could be supported, and those kinds of things. I think that demand has to be raised, and the kind of coordinated strategy that goes beyond only lobbying legislators. Only lobbying legislators without action, I don't think raises the demand for Medicare for all as being a life and death demand. And so, again, yeah, you're right. It's going to take some time, but we have to be intentionally raising awareness or consciousness and positioning the organization of workers as a social movement to carry out this possibility of really actually challenging the operation of the system so that it takes the working class seriously, if nothing else.
You recently talked about how the South is in need of a mass labor organizing effort akin to Operation Dixie of the 1940s. Can you talk more about that particular campaign and why you think the Bessemer Union struggle shows how the time is right to organize the South?
The organization, right after World War II, people started, workers, soldiers started coming home, experiencing maybe even a sharper discrimination than what they left, particularly from the South, etc. The apparent nature of the South in the national economy. Operation Dixie, which took place in the late 1940s, right around the time that the Taft-Hartley Act, pretty much an anti-labor act, was passed, including this section of 14B, which was called Right to Work laws, which really was developed in order to strengthen or to support the states' rights movement, the racist movement, particularly, that existed in the South that would challenge national laws and policies through states' rights. So Operation Dixie, pretty much a CIO, or this was before the merger of the AFL and the CIO, campaign to organize in the South. Probably one of the major industries was the textile industry, which was still in the late 1940s, primarily majority white. The 34 major strike of the textile workers was majority white workers in the textile industry. The organizing really did not take up the struggle against racism, and did not try to organize industries that were majority black workers. You had the kind of early organizing that went up into the 40s of the tobacco worker industry, which was majority black, overwhelmingly black industries. And so, there was this weakness, again, of not wanting to appear to be giving some level of power and support for black workers during that time. But the important aspect of it was that the CIO took it up, a federation took it up and made, at least in its initiation, Operation Dixie to be popular, including a cultural movement by forces like Pete Seeger and others. But it failed. The Wagner Act that had been passed around 34, 35 kind of became the foundation of the National Labor Relations Act in terms of certain protections for efforts to organize a union. It seemed like Operation Dixie was relying more on the Wagner Act than it relied on its early mobilization that really created the conditions that even forced Roosevelt into signing the Wagner Act. That is the struggles, of the 20s and the 30s, where you had these rank and file and left organizations that formed to deal with industrial unionism that broke up in many ways craft unionism, where workers were unionized around their crafts, and this still created a real separation among the workers, and certainly isolated black workers who were not really a part of the main crafts. The 20s and 30s, united the workers that led to this reform, the Wagner Act, and then eventually the National Labor Relations Act. It seemed like the same infrastructure, the same rank and file organization, and the involvement of the left, the radical forces, in the trade unions, was non-existent in a serious way in Operation Dixie. And again, Operation Dixie, was, taking place during the kind of beginnings, of the emergence of the McCarthy period, this very, repressive period, almost Trumpism probably, drew a lot from that period. So it was a very difficult period, I think, in organizing. We sometimes forget about the history that allowed, labor to make advances in difficult times. I think we need a new kind of Operation Dixie in terms of the collaboration of unions and left and progressive organizations around a strategy to organize the South. And that strategy has to also place in the picture that the South is a strategic region of the U.S. and global economy, or U.S. and global capital. The South, as a region, has one of the highest concentrations of foreign direct investments in auto and, electronics, other key industries in the South. And so we have to understand what organizing and building power in this region, working class power in this region, aligned with the power of the black masses that whose conditions of underdevelopment and lack of qualitative connections to institutions that we need, for our health and for our education and those kinds of things. This would be seen as a campaign that has not only national but international importance. And it creates the possibility, at least in my thinking and the thinking of a number of others, that it could generate a kind of more militant, U.S. national labor movement and an international labor movement. I mean, that's what the South represents in the global economy. And that's not often talked about, or I don't hear it talked about ever in terms of an analysis of the conditions that organizing in the South could impact. I don't know what it could be called, but I think the intent of a federation taking up this question of organizing in the South is what we need to emerge in this period.
Saladin Muhammad is a retired international rep for the United Electrical Workers Union and a founding member of both Black Workers for Justice and the Southern Workers Assembly. Music for Southern Discomfort was recorded by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Jonathan Michels.